In 1940, after a decade of misery and hardship, America was still reeling from the Great Depression. But as a new decade began, another tragedy was looming in the black forests of Europe and the remote jungles of the Pacific. And by the end of 1941, America found itself in a Second World War. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, many African Americans rushed to the service of their country. They wanted to join the fight for freedom, even though their own civil rights were still being denied to them on the home front. Their efforts to enlist were sometimes derailed before they got off the ground.
They were yelling and screaming and begging for people to come and volunteer, so I volunteered. And I went down to the Naval Recruiting Office in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the young naval recruiter asked me what could I do. And I told him I could run an office. I was able to take shorthand. I have 3 gold medals in typing. And oh yes, I have a PhD in history from Harvard. And he said, you have everything but color. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I thought that there was an emergency, but apparently there's not, so I bid you good day, and I left.
While many African Americans met resistance at the recruiting office, an opportunity presented itself in Alabama, the heart of the Jim Crow South. It would lead to fame and glory for nearly 1,000 African American men.
They called it the Tuskegee Experiment, where you not only had pilots learning how to fly aircraft, you had bombardiers, you had service people, you had technicians, anybody that would help that airplane fight for our country in war. You had the individuals there at the Tuskegee Experiment. We now know that in history really as the Tuskegee Airmen.
The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African Americans to serve in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the forerunner of today's Air Force. Composed of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, air traffic controllers, maintenance men, and support staff, they were part of the Tuskegee Experiment to train African Americans to fly and maintain combat aircraft in World War II.
It was a policy of the United States before the war started to bar African Americans from serving in the Air Corps as pilots. Sure, they can serve as cooks or stewards or even mechanics, but not to fly. And they changed that policy, so on July 19th, if my memory is correct, 1941, they formed the first unit at Tuskegee, Alabama.
The first unit was formed, but before the Tuskegee Experiment could get off the ground, it needed funds. Many in Washington believed African Americans lacked sufficient bravery, intelligence, and discipline to fly combat missions. One very influential person in Washington, however, disagreed and was determined to prove the naysayers wrong.
Eleanor Roosevelt goes down and she wants to see what this operation is all about. She walks up to Chief Anderson, who's the head of the training corps, and she said, I hear Negroes can't fly planes. Would you mind taking me up? And so Chief Anderson said, sure. But meanwhile, the Secret Service that were there said, no, we don't want you to do this. And they called up Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and said, she's going to fly in this airplane. What do we do? And he says, hey, there's nothing we can do. You got to let her fly. And so she went up and flew with the Chief Anderson for about a half an hour and said, well, I guess you can fly. Went home, and about a day later, they set up a really good training program down there for African-American pilots.
With the help of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the Tuskegee Experiment received its funding, and the Tuskegee Army Airfield was in business. But the hardships and indignities the cadets would endure were many, sometimes even fatal.
My father was on a night training mission from Godwinfield, Kentucky to Tuskegee Army Airfield. However, they did not have enough high-octane fuel at Tuskegee Airfield, so he had to land at Gunner Airfield to refuel. They told the pilots not to land at Gunner, not black pilots. Bad things can happen there. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of what happened. I read the accident report. They said they didn't follow procedures. Well, anybody can say that, but did that actually happen? Because shortly after takeoff, lost both engines. Lost both engines. It was airborne and crashed 2 miles at the end of the runway. They just treated like you were just a lower class animal of some sort. You see a white person coming, if you're on the sidewalk, you have to get off, and it's just all kinds of things. And of course, the military, I didn't like the segregated services. All of our higher ranking officers were all white, and they weren't very nice.
The cadets were painfully aware that this was an experiment. Individual success meant success for all African Americans. If they crashed, all African Americans went down with them.
Can you imagine the pressure? Beyond just the normal pressure of being in the military unit and going through basic camp. I can, because I'm a military intelligence officer, former captain in the Army. So I know very well the anxiety associated with the challenges of basic training. But when you add on top of that, you're persona non grata, you're expected to perform under this deficit model of you're at risk of not being an effective pilot. You persevere, you excel beyond, and you do it with elegance and grace.
The Tuskegee Airmen did persevere through their training. Between 1942 and 1946, Tuskegee Army Airfield graduated 993 African American pilots. One of the first graduates of the Tuskegee was a West Point graduate, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Davis was selected as the commander of the 99th Squadron and the 332nd Fighter Group, and later became the U.S. Air Force's first African American general officer. Throughout the war, various attempts were made to discredit African American combat pilots. Their courage and skill, however, eventually earned them respect from those who first questioned their ability and doubted their courage. Dubbed the Red Tails because of the distinctive tail markings on their airplanes, they became known as experts in bomber escort and enjoyed the distinction of never losing a bomber they were escorting. No other group in the United States Armed Forces could make that claim. Despite the impressive battle records in the service of their country, African Americans continued to endure racism at home. African Americans in the military were said to be fighting two wars, one against the enemy in Europe and another against racism.
They're fighting for their country, a country that really doesn't even appreciate them that much, but they're willing to give their lives for it, and that just amazed me. I mean, you have been pushed to the side by a country, you're going to go out there and possibly give your life, and that's the most important thing to you at this point in time.
On the home front in the African American community, a campaign to illustrate their frustration was conceived. They called it the Double V.
It's not enough to have victory abroad. We must have victory at home. We must do something about all this discrimination at home. We must do something to equalize opportunities and so forth. So yes, a victory abroad, yes, but a victory at home also. That's the Double V.
In the end, the Tuskegee Airmen left no doubt in white America's mind that the Tuskegee experiment was indeed a stunning success. By war's end, an amazing 1,578 missions had been flown, with 865 commendations for bravery awarded. Their courage, their dignity, their grace under fire would pave the way for generations to follow.
The number one thing they did was just open the door. I mean, it's always hardest to be first. They lived through you can't do the job. There's something different about you because of the color of your skin, and you have no depth perception, you aren't willing to work hard. All that stuff went away. When they went out there and broke down those barriers, they absorbed all those spears, so I don't have to. The spears I absorb are much smaller. I am able to go out there and excel just based on the fact that they went out there and opened up this door so I could step through it.
These are the guys who put their life on the line. And they demonstrated that they are willing to do this, even if they were victims of outrageous discrimination, that they were Americans. You know, that's something. And I think they should be remembered for what they did. And I think it would make the generations that followed a bit proud to say that, gee, I had grandparents who were gutsy like this.
Victory abroad? Yes. Victory at home? Soon after World War II, President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces, citing the bravery and unflinching patriotism of the African American men who fought and died for their country. Freedom's song, was marching to a new tune, and more victories were to follow.